All right, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Roya Hakakian, and it is my honor to be moderating this fantastic and very important panel today on the subject of the downing of the Ukrainian Flight 752 back in the January of this year by the Iranian members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. We have a great group of panelists this afternoon, whom I will introduce very briefly. However, I want to emphasize the word briefly because I want you to think of this introduction as a mere teaser, because the bios are incredibly wonderful. And I invite you all to look at these biographies and discover these great individuals who are involved in this case. I'd like to start with our first speakers, who will be Senator Marilou McPhedran and Member of Parliament Michael Levitt, and who are here with us at the moment. Senator Marilou McPhedran has been a dean at the University of Winnipeg and the Global College in Manitoba. In 1985, Senator McPhedran became the youngest lawyer to be named a member of the Order of Canada in recognition of her co-leadership of the Ad Hoc Committee of Canadian Women on the Constitution. The Ad Hoc Committee was a grassroots movement for strengthening equality rights during the drafting of the Constitution of Canada. In 2001, Senator McPhedran was named one of Canada's 10 most influential women rights activists by the Homemakers magazine. And these are merely a few of the opening lines that I was very biased to, because they were all about her role as a leader in women's equality rights. The next person I would like to introduce is parliamentary member Mr. Michael Levitt. He has been a chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee and a co-chair of the Raoul Wallenberg All-Party Parliamentary Caucus for Human Rights, and formerly the chair of the International Human Rights Committee. In those capacities, he had also launched important parliamentary initiatives, including co-chairing the annual Iran Accountability Week in the Parliament. These two will be our first two speakers today, and I would like to open with my own remarks and hoping to get everyone talking about some of the issues that those of us who have been watching the violations of human rights in Iran and the issue and the political place of Iran in the last 40 years within the politics of Middle East and elsewhere might wish to consider. One of the very interesting aspects of this particular tragedy is that, unlike the overwhelming majority of other human rights violations and the governmental violations that Iran has committed and continues to commit, is that it occurs in the overlap of the Iranian politics and Iranian domestic issues as well as international ones. Meaning that so many of the violations of human rights that do occur in Iran do not spill over to the international community. And therefore, it makes it much harder for the international community to exert any influence. There are legions of activists and human rights activists, women's activists, and political oppositions, journalists who have been arrested and continue to languish in prison, but their cases are much harder to influence or for the international community to get involved with. However, in the past 40 years, there have been few opportunities where a violation that has taken place within Iran or to an Iranian citizen, however, involving the international community, provided an opportunity for non-Iranians and for human rights advocates to get involved. This, in my belief, is one of those cases where the downing of the Ukrainian flight, given the involvement of Ukraine, Canada, the United Kingdom, as having had citizens on this flight, and all other interested parties, provides an opportunity for all of you to have a say and to press Iran in ways that other human rights advocates and others who wish to press Iran cannot do so. One prime example of such a case occurred in 1996 when the editor-in-chief of an Iranian literary magazine, the equivalent of Iran's New Yorker magazine, named Faraj Sarkouhi, tried to leave Iran to come to Frankfurt, Germany, to attend a pen meeting and subsequently visit his family. Sarkouhi was kidnapped before boarding the plane. However, Iran refused to accept that he had been kidnapped and blamed the Germans for having stolen him or having kidnapped him at the other side. Anyway, one of the most beautiful aspects of this case was that an international cargo insurance body, air cargo insurance body, after about 2 weeks that he had disappeared, pressed Iran by saying that if Sarkouhi didn't turn up, they would have to cancel all of Iran's insurance coverage for their flights. And that was obviously going to cost Iran a great deal in trade, and it would have paralyzed Iran's international travel and cargo trade. And therefore, within about 48 hours, Sarkouhi was found. And that set a wonderful precedent for everyone to see that whenever there was a small window for the international community to press Iran, that things actually did happen. What I look forward to hearing from everyone on this panel is, number one, obviously, how the unique situation of this particular issue can provide everyone else to influence Iran, and to give justice to these families, and subsequently, is this an opportunity for the international community to effect change in the way Iran treats human rights activists, and in general, make Iran behave far more responsibly within the international scene and with respect to its human rights community within. So without further ado, I will now turn the conversation over to Senator McPhedran.
Thank you very much, Roya. I am an independent senator in Manitoba, and I want to recognize Manitoba is on Treaty 1 territory for the Anishinaabeg Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dakota peoples, and also is the homeland, the heart of the Métis Nation. I very much appreciate this invitation from Professor Cotler and the Center, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Mr. Esmaeillion about the reality for families that have suffered such tremendous and tragic loss, and also to hear from my parliamentary colleague, Michael Levitt, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and our Special Advisor for Canada, Ralph Goodale, and also, of course, to hear more from you, Professor Akhavan, about the nature of this case and what I think we are seeing to be violations of international law that are already actively occurring. In particular, as a parliamentarian, I really want to extend to the families who have lost, in many cases, more than one member of their family in PS752 in the bombing of that flight, and to say to you that I'm committed as a parliamentarian, as an independent senator, to do whatever I can to use my voice to work with my colleagues on the Human Rights Interparliamentary Caucus within Parliament. Hopefully, we will be able to be together and working more effectively when that is possible in the midst of this pandemic. And for our conversation today, I really want to emphasize how important it is that we have the kind of amalgam of voices that have been brought to this virtual roundtable today, and to really also state in solidarity with the families and with all of you working in so many different ways on this very important issue, that this is really about transparency, and it's about integrity, and it's about upholding international law and standards that are human rights standards, and to not see this in the abstract, to know that what we're really talking about here is the living of human rights, not lip service, and the way in which we, in my case as a parliamentarian, but really all of us working together from many different perspectives, can activate and galvanize the systems that are at play here with this overarching goal of reaching some form of justice and accountability and reparations for the families who have suffered such a tremendous loss. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. Miigwech, merci.
Mr. Levitt, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you to the Raoul Wallenberg Center and Irwin Cotler for inviting me to address this event to commemorate the victims of UIA flight PS752 and call for justice and accountability from the Iranian regime. It's been just over 6 months since an Iranian surface-to-air missile destroyed Flight 752, taking the lives of 176 innocent men, women, and children, including so many Canadians. In the immediate aftermath, it was hard to find a member of the Iranian Canadian community who did not know one of the victims. This tragedy deeply touched all Canadians. As we remember the victims of this crime, we must always be relentless in the pursuit of justice for them and their families, and for all Canadians. Immediately in January, we saw concerted action by Canada and the other countries impacted by this tragedy to secure both an appropriate investigation and reparations for the families. Canada's convening of the International Coordination and Response Group for the victims of Flight PS752, including Afghanistan, Sweden, Ukraine, and the United Kingdom, was an important step forward in working to hold the Iranian regime accountable and helping families seek closure. Unfortunately, given the regime's decision to deflect and deny responsibility, this work is ongoing, but we must not stop. Canada must continue working with our international partners to ensure a comprehensive, transparent investigation and compensation for the victims' families. Just last month, the Iranian foreign minister finally agreed to send the black boxes to France for analysis after months of resistance and reversals. Similarly, the regime finally agreeing to enter into negotiations on reparations is an important and necessary step forward towards helping families find closure. But can they be trusted? Not just in Canada, but every affected country and member of the international community must continue to tirelessly hold Iran to account and seek transparency, justice, and compensation on behalf of the families and loved ones of the victims. I'm skeptical that the Iranian regime will follow through on these commitments, and we must continue to be clear-eyed about anything this regime commits to, given our prior experiences. The denials, hiding of evidence, intimidations of victims' families, and the lead Iranian investigator's removal for admitting that the regime knew it was putting civilian airliners in danger all speak to the regime's culpability in this situation. Despite the release of the regime's report into the crash this past weekend, it's clear that their focus is on shifting blame rather than accepting responsibility. There must be a full and transparent investigation in accordance with international standards and reparations for victims' families. The basis for all our actions must be accountability. It must be accountability. The Iranian regime and the individual officials who order and profit from its injustices must be held responsible for these actions. Time and time again, we've seen that the Iranian regime is a bad actor domestically and internationally. Every year, we see a further decline in the human rights situation in Iran and the increasing export of its contempt for human rights and terror across the Middle East and beyond. This is a regime that has institutionalized discrimination and persecution against women, LGBTQ persons, religious minorities, including the Baha'i, and other marginalized groups. It is our duty to continue to shine a light on the mistreatment of women who suffer under the misogynistic legal and political system, the Iranian people who suffer from corruption done with impunity, including the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and senior officials and judges who pillage the Iranian economy for personal gain, for the political prisoners who suffer for their beliefs, for the dual nationals, religious leaders, journalists, academics, environmentalists, for all the people this regime has made to suffer, for the terror that Iran has exported around the world, threatening millions of people, not just regionally, but well beyond. Every May in Parliament, we hold the annual Iran Accountability Week. This year would have been the 8th year. And while we could not gather to hear firsthand testimony of those affected by the regime, we are united in calling for justice for the regime's victims. While Canada continues to uphold strict sanctions against Iran for its atrocious human rights record and weapons programs, we must continue to push for accountability and an end to this impunity, raising our voices as we do every year as a leader on the resolution on Iranian human rights and repression adopted by the United Nations, but also using every legal and legislative tool at our disposal, including the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act and Magnitsky sanctions against the individuals responsible for these crimes. It's imperative that we continue to work together to ensure a full and transparent investigation, hold those responsibilities to account, and ensure justice for the victims of Flight 752, for their families, and for all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, Parliamentary Representative Mr. Levitt, and I will move on to Mr. Esmaeillion, Payam Akhavan, and Honourable Judge Cotler. To introduce Mr. Hamid Esmaeilion, who has lost his wife and his daughter on that flight. I need to say first and foremost something that probably most of you don't have access to, which is that Mr. Esmaeillion has been, in addition to a professional dentist, a writer as well. But in the past 6 months, he has also managed to become singularly the voice of all the people in Iran who have lost a loved one at the hands of this regime. His social media account chronicling his own experience of the loss has become the go-to place for all the people who have either a prisoner in prison or have had a loved one die at the hands of the regime. So he's more than the spokesperson for the victims' families. He's become one of the spokespeople for the nation as well. Payam Akhavan has been a human rights attorney and an outspoken person on behalf of many victims around the world. He is a senior fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, a professor of international law at McGill University, and a senior fellow at Massey College, University of Toronto. And he holds many other academic appointments at universities around the world. He was formerly a UN prosecutor at The Hague, served on the UN human rights, served as the rights investigator for the UN in the cases that involved Bosnian, Cambodian, East Timorese, Guatemalan, and Rwandese violations, and currently serves as counsel and advocate before the International Court of Justice, including the cases of Rohingya minority from Myanmar. He has been one of the close counsels of to the families of Flight 752 in the past several months. And what was not on the bio that he submitted is that he and I, along with a third person who happens to be my husband, established the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center in 2001 in Connecticut, which has since been gathering and accumulating and producing reports on the violations of human rights in Iran. Last but not least, Honourable Professor Irwin Cotler, the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Foundation, has a very, very particularly exciting bio. He is the Emeritus Professor of Law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice, and Attorney General of Canada, longtime Member of Parliament, international human rights lawyer, and counsel to prisoners of conscience from many countries around the world. He's a founder and chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He has also been a counsel to the Supreme Court of the United States on many, many cases that he has been consulted with. I received a letter from him this morning, an email saying, keep my bio short, so I will keep his bio short, but we all need to look him up. Last but not least, the concluding remarks today will be delivered by Mr. Honourable Ralph Goodell, Prime Minister's Special Advisor on Canada's ongoing response to the Ukrainian International Airlines tragedy. He was first elected to the Parliament of Canada in 1974 at the age of 24. And since then, Honourable Ralph Goodell has served in many capacities in the Canadian government and Parliament, including most recently as the leader of the government in the House of Commons, Minister of Public Works and Government Services, Minister of Finance, and Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. I now turn the floor over to Mr. Esmaeillion.
We are the survivors of a crime. We are the mothers and fathers wandering around airports, clenching a child's jacket. We are desperately searching for our children and grandchildren. We are the tired, heartbroken spouses still holding a bouquet of flowers while we mourn the loss of our lovers over the skies of an airport. We are the grief-stricken children, tormented by the nightmare of explosions in the skies. We are the brothers and sisters with nothing left other than the silent pictures on our walls. We are the survivors of a crime. Since January 8, 2020, we are the survivors of a crime. We only bought airplane tickets. We are imprisoned in an eternal winter, and we know that other than the warmth of our bleeding hearts, we have nothing to warm our shivering bones with. Look at us now. Our airplane was shut down. Look at us now, baffled by inhumanity and cold-blooded murder. Was it with intent? How will we know without investigations? How will we know when the truth is bulldozed away and buried secretly? But no one accepts the truth, as everyone around us insists that we must be patient, that we must wait, that the truth is confidential. Our case is in the clutches of intelligence and military organizations, but we know that our loved ones were sacrificed for either the beginning or the end of someone else's war. They were sacrificed for the ambitions of religious leaders in Tehran, sacrificed for the warmongering generals of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, intoxicated by delusions of exporting their revolution. We know that our loved ones were used as human shields. Everyone knows, but no one utters the truth. We are the survivors of a crime. The crime scene was destroyed and the belongings of our loved ones were shamelessly pillaged, stolen, looted, and buried. The wedding rings of our loved ones were pulled off of their lifeless hands while their murderers stood over their corpses congratulating us for their martyrdom. They lied to us. They lied to the world. They said nothing of the truth, and other than a handful of lies, they gave us nothing of the remains of our loved ones to remember them by. We are expected to be happy that Canadian investigators were permitted to visit the destroyed crash site, allowing them the privilege of photographing a few pieces of debris after bulldozers had flattened the smoldering land upon which the truth could have been pieced together. We are the survivors of a crime. Look at us. We had no opportunity to mourn. Look at us. We have been robbed of the chance to weep alone. During every one of the past 187 days, we have shivered in torment, hearing news from the Iranian propaganda machine or some other country, news of secret agreements, the fate of the black boxes, and the silence of international organizations. We have been writing letters over and over again, every day, delivering them with shaking hands and writing more with jittery fingers. We huddled together, organized an association. We shared our most intimate memories and biographies of 176 passengers, children, PhD students, professors, 8 entire families, innocent victims whose aspirations, dreams, and achievements shall never be realized. We shared our private photos and videos against our will so the world will not forget us. Every night when the rest of the world sleeps, we lay down unable to close our tearful eyes, wishing never to awaken in this desperate world of injustice and treachery. We are the survivors of a crime. ICAO hides behind neutrality without any recollection of why it was founded 75 years ago. They patronize us with empty slogans of neutrality and lessons to respect for the sovereignty of their members. They insist on treating equally those who break the law and the victims who deserve justice. We say to them, they murdered 176 human beings. They say we must support all sides. We say they will never have real investigation into their own crimes. We say their aviation agencies are not independent. They say they are controlled by the perpetrators of the crime that took our loved ones from us. We say at least condemn their actions, but they remain silent. We are the survivors of a crime. The backroom negotiations of politicians from different countries have robbed our eyes of any sleep. They speak of reopening embassies over the graves of our loved ones. They negotiate the price of their lives. What is the price of a 9-year-old passenger who spoke in 3 languages and made beautiful drawings? What about the 20-year-old girl with beautiful hair who was going to be a physician? How about the price of the university professor who loved sitting in the shade and kiss his little daughter? We ask them to step away from the auction block. We say that without independent, fair investigations and justice, there is no compensation. We say that compensation for us is knowing the truth and justice itself. We say that our compensation is in knowing how our loved ones were taken away from us and why. For us, the compensation is knowing that no one will ever have to endure the pain we are to endure for the rest of our lives. Instead, we hear that the law is the law. We say that we want the truth. They say you must wait. But can you see? Can you see that we waited 7 months for the damned black boxes? Can you see that the black boxes are the first item in any airplane crash investigations? that they are not the last items to reveal the truth? 7 months we waited. Lockerbie 2 days, MH17 4 days, Ethiopian Airlines 4 days, Pakistani Airline just this past May 4 days before the black box were read. Instead, we must endure a laughable third report insisting that the military installation was misaligned by 107 degrees. Are there any secret deals? We don't know. Are there any backroom agreements? We don't know. We waited 7 months for the black boxes and still do not know if they were delivered them or not, if there's anything on them or not, if they have been destroyed or not. They say that we must prepare ourselves for years to struggle. We say, do not scare us with the passage of time. All of our watches are frozen on 18 minutes past 6 o'clock in the morning of January 8 in Tehran. Do not scare us with 5 years or 10 years. We walk, we breathe, but we are not alive to feel the passage of time. We were on that airplane too, but we were not buried. We are still flying on that fiery airplane as passengers of the crashing inferno that shall continue to fly for the remainder of our terrifying lives. We are the survivors of a crime, and we know that the Islamic Republic draws from 32 years of organized crime to misrepresent the truth to buy more time. They seek to buy so much time until we tire and perish in desperation, one by one. No, we fear not the passage of time or the intrigue of politics, nor do we fear the complexities of international diplomacy, the threats of tyrants, nor the intimidations of their operatives. We will not relent in our fight for justice and our demands to treat our lost loved ones with dignity, for they were not numbers on a ticket or statistics on a chart, but innocent human beings that deserve to live their lives. What is the meaning of neutrality when we speak of innocent victims and perpetrators of a crime? Our demands are clear. 1, we shall never accept the results of investigations that are led by Iranian government. If the ICAO laws do not account for a case of this kind, change the laws, not the truth. Do not leave the perpetrators to investigate their own crime. We shall not accept their conclusions. Change the rules so no other government ever dares to fire missiles at innocent passengers 3 minutes after their own airport at 4,000 feet. 2, 3 reports published by Iranian government prove that the airspace over Iran is not safe. Until the PS752 crime is not resolved, close the Iranian civilian air corridor. Do not reward criminals. Prosecute them instead, and by doing so, save the lives of more passengers and crew. Save lives instead of supporting criminals. Ask who gave the orders to keep the airspace over Tehran open during military conflict. Ask who ordered the firing of the missiles and why. Ask who gave permission to fly despite warnings from safety and transportation organizations. Ask why the crash site was destroyed within hours or why evidence was destroyed. Ask why witnesses were intimidated and family members were persecuted, threatened, and intimidated. Think of the lives that will be lost if you don't find the answers of these questions. 3, we ask the Canadian government to open criminal investigations into this crime. The Iranian government will not cooperate, and they are disqualified to lead the investigation. It is imperative that a criminal investigation is initiated by Canada. It is necessary that truth and justice shall come before compensation. Canada lost 85 of its citizens and residents. Help us to open this case in an impartial international tribunal where truth matters. 4, we want to have an observer representative in the investigations. We are the biggest stakeholders in this tragedy and deserve to know everything. We have no trust whatsoever in the Iranian officials. We have lost our faith in the ICAO. Other parties to this case also seem to have capitulated to accepting the Iranian government to lead the investigations. Under these circumstances, no secret or classified information has any meaning for us, the survivors of a crime. The world must expose any and all information and share those unconditionally with us, the families of the victims. How can we trust a world that in over 6 months has failed to compel a murderous, oppressive government to surrender even the black boxes? If our demands are not met, if the laws don't change, our fate will be the same as that of the families of Zahra Kazemi, Kavus Sayed Emami, Saeed Malekpur, Nilufar Bayani, and many, many others. In fact, the world's fate will be no different should the Iranian government be allowed to make a mockery of international law and human rights with impunity. We are the survivors of this crime, so do something so there will be no more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Esmaeillion, for those very powerful and deeply touching words. I now turn the floor over to Mr. Payam Akhavan.
Thank you, Roya, and I'm begin by expressing my deepest condolences to my dear friend and brother, Hamid, for the loss of his daughter and his wife, and extend the same condolences to all the families who've lost their loved ones in something which one could simply call a tragedy. But I think the Raoul Wallenberg Center, for whom I have the greatest respect, to my dear friend and colleague, Professor Cotler, has said it right in the title of this event: Securing Justice and Accountability for the Canadians Murdered in the Bombing of Flight PS752. So I would like to explore the idea of murder, the idea of a killing which is not just the result of human error, but the result, at the very least, of criminal recklessness, of deliberately putting civilian aircraft in harm's way in circumstances where it was foreseeable that PS752 would be shot down. I begin by saying that the road to justice, we know very well, those of us who are involved in international law and human rights struggles, the road to justice is long and tortuous. And I want to recognize the tremendous outpouring of grief and support by the Canadian public, which touched me deeply as a Canadian Iranian. And I think that we should be very grateful that the Prime Minister has appointed a person of the reputation and caliber of Ralph Goodale to address this pressing matter for Canada, not just the families of the victims, but for all of us who call ourselves Canadians. This is a matter of great importance to make sure that there is justice for this crime. But I also want to emphasize that this is not something that is going to be addressed in the short run. There has to be a long-term commitment, or else we will never see justice. Bearing that in mind, I just want to provide a brief overview of the undisputed facts so that we're clear about the framing of the destruction of PS752. We know that on January 3rd, the United States killed General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad airport. We know that Iran threatened retaliation against the United States. And by January 7, Iran had mobilized its ballistic missiles to attack two US air bases, two US military bases in Iraq, in Anbar province and Erbil, respectively. At 10:30 p.m. on January 7th, a Tor M1 surface-to-air missile system was positioned close to a military base in Tehran. At 1:30 a.m. on January 8th, 12 ballistic missiles were launched towards the US military base in Anbar province, and 5 against another military base in Erbil. The reason why the IRGC had the Tor M1 missile system stationed throughout Tehran is because they anticipated an American counterattack. And under those circumstances, it is blindingly obvious that the airspace should have been closed. In fact, the International Civil Aviation Organization has a specific regulation in respect of the safety of civil airliners in the context of military activities. And we also know that the airspace should have been closed because on January 11, after 3 days of denial, when the evidence became overwhelming that the aircraft had in fact been shot down and the Iranian government and the IRGC had to admit what had happened, General Hajizadeh, the commander of the IRGC aerospace forces himself said, and I quote, "We requested several times that the airspace should be clear." And this was under circumstances where the military forces were on the highest military alert. And then he goes on to say, but because of the consideration of certain dear ones, this did not happen, meaning to say the airspace was not closed. Who are the dear ones that General Hajizadeh refers to? Well, if one looks at the IRGC chain of command, the next person up is the IRGC Commander-in-Chief, General Hossein Salam. And of course, General Hossein Salam is part of the Supreme National Security Council, which apparently collectively made the decision to use civilian airliners as human shields because it offered a certain military advantage, whether in not alerting the United States to Iran's impending ballistic missile attack or in deterring an American counterattack by using civilian airliners. Under these circumstances, it is not entirely far-fetched to speak about murder. Recklessness is a state of mind where one, whether certain consequences intended or not, knowingly takes a risk, knowing that the consequences, in this particular case, the destruction of a civilian airliner, is a foreseeable consequence. Hamid referred to the recent report that was produced by Iran. The report, I believe, raises far more questions than it answers. I have never heard of a situation in which the Tor M1 missile system, one of the most sophisticated systems, each unit of which cost $25 million, Russian manufactured, cannot tell the difference between north and south. A compass purchased from Canadian Tire would be able to tell someone which direction is north and which direction is south. And to add to that, the idea that it's impossible to tell the difference using this sophisticated radar system between a massive civilian airliner with 2 giant engines flying in a northwesterly direction and a cruise missile coming purportedly from a southeasterly direction, in addition to numerous other leaps in logic, suggests that the investigation is nothing but whitewash. I want to conclude, given the limited time that we have, by saying that we have to listen to the voices of Hamid and those who've lost their loved ones. Compensation is important but secondary to justice. And justice in the international context requires the full exploration of all the options which are available. And that includes, among other things, the 1971 Montreal Convention on the Safety of Civil Aviation, which obligates states to investigate and prosecute those that are responsible for the destruction of civilian aircraft. And I will end by noting the irony that after Iran Air Flight 655 was shot down by the USS Vincennes in the Persian Gulf in 1988, that is exactly what Iran demanded of the United States. So I would hope that Canada, in concert with the Ukraine and the other concerned governments and with the support of the international community will make it clear to Iran that it cannot simply buy its way out of justice by offering some measure of compensation. And I'm skeptical whether they will even offer compensation, and that the international community demands that those responsible for, in effect, the murder of the 176 passengers should be brought to justice. So I once again thank the Wallenberg Center and my dear friends and colleagues, Senator McPhedran, Mr. Levitt, Mr. Goodale, and Irwin Cotler, for joining the Canadian Iranian community in seeking justice and accountability for this crime.
Thank you, Payam. This was a very succinct summary. It also laid out very well for the possibilities that can be pursued beyond the mere issue of compensation, which I think is really key in this case, given Iran's track record on all the other violations of human rights and the necessity for Iran to really be held accountable, especially in the absence of other international involvement between Iran and the European or the American Western communities in general. I will now turn the floor over to Professor Cotler, who chairs the Raoul Wallenberg Foundation, and together both he and the foundation have become two of the most important, if not the most important voices advocating for the cause of human rights in Iran today.
That we meet at an important moment of remembrance in the immediate aftermath of the 6-month anniversary of the tragic and criminal downing of the Ukrainian airliner, where 176 passengers were killed, amongst whom were 55 Canadians and 30 permanent residents. Iran initially sought to cover this up, but was forced to admit that its Revolutionary Guards shot down the plane. But as the Canadian government put it at that moment, and I quote, "This tragedy should never have occurred, and the families and loved ones deserve to know why and how it happened." Indeed, the remembrance and horror of this tragedy are indelibly imprinted in the minds and hearts of the survivors, their families and loved ones, as Hamid and Payam so compellingly and eloquently articulated. A number of initiatives have been launched. Very briefly, Canada announced the formation of an international coordination and response group along with 4 other countries who lost their citizens. On March 31st, Ralph Goodale was appointed a special advisor, and I'm delighted he is part of this conversation today. The families of the victims established an international association for redress and justice, and you heard Hamid's most compelling remarks in that regard. Professor Payam Akhavan, as its lead counsel, has laid out the legal framework, and both our parliamentarians in both houses have articulated the involvement of these houses. In particular, however, what is happening with respect to this inquiry can only be understood against the background of Khamenei's Iran. And I use that term to distinguish it from the people and the publics of Iran who continue to be the targets of mass domestic repression. What we have been witnessing in Khamenei's Iran is backdrop and context for the massive domestic repression, the culture of corruption, criminality, and impunity that underpins it, that has found expression in the ongoing criminalization of fundamental freedoms, the criminalization of women's rights, the criminalization of environmental rights, where environmental protection has been made a crime. The criminalization of religious and ethnic rights, where it's referenced the Baha'i are metaphor and message, and the arrest, imprisonment, torture, and detention of leaders of all civil society groups in Iran, be they journalists, students, trade union leaders, lawyers, human rights defenders. In a word, we have been witnessing in Iran, and it continues as we meet the criminalization of innocence. It is against this backdrop and context that the following violations must be appreciated and understood. One, the Iranian regime appointed Chief Justice Ibrahim Raisi to lead the investigation. Chief Justice Raisi was a member of the death squads of 1988 that executed thousands of Iranian dissidents. The House of Commons, a Canadian Parliament, unanimously adopted a resolution declaring these executions to be, in a word, crimes against humanity, and established a political prisoner day to commemorate the victims. Second, Iran appointed a close associate of Ibrahim Raisi, to be the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament. Third, the black boxes that have been mentioned have yet to be examined. A case study of Iranian national, delay, obfuscation, and denial. Number four, the families of the victims, and we should never forget this, as we meet, continue to be harassed, intimidated, and threatened, a cruel mockery of any form of consolation, support, or compensation for the families. Number five, peaceful protesters in Iran protesting the tragedy and its cover-up have themselves been imprisoned. Number six, students engaged in a memorial ceremony for the victims in Shiraz have themselves been sentenced to long-term imprisonment. Finally, and perhaps most important, Iran's chief investigator of the tragedy, as Payam pointed out, disclosed that in fact, Iran violated civilian airspace in order to cover up an imminent attack. As Payam put it, putting the civilians as human shields to cover up a crime. In conclusion, the challenge for a transparent, independent, just, and accountable inquiry with compensation and closure for the victims remains. This will require, number one, that there be an independent, impartial, and accountable investigation. And this must be a first demand by the International Coordination and Response Group. Two, it should ask for the Chief Justice Raisi to be replaced as head of the inquiry. Number three, it should call on Iran to cease and desist from all forms of repression of media, of protesters, of mourners. Number four, it should ask Iran to cease and desist from any ongoing intimidation and harassment of families and loved ones. It should call on Iran to finally establish an independent, transparent, and impartial inquiry, and since it is arguably unable to do so, then what we need at this point is the international community to establish an international and independent inquiry. Finally, we need to explore the various legal remedies that could be available, including interstate remedies, such as an initiative before the International Court of Justice, criminal prosecution, civil remedies, class actions, and the like. In a word, the original demand need, requirement for an independent, impartial, international inquiry providing justice and accountability, justice for the victims, accountability for the violators, compensation and closure still remains and demands to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Cotler. What you just summarized in those few sentences is really key as we hear, especially here in the United States and within the Persian-speaking media, that had the United States not conducted its assassination against the Iranian general in Iraq, it would not have prompted, or the bombing or the shooting down of the flight would have never happened. Of course, it seems very obvious to the rest of us why this makes no sense. However, for those who are trying to create the grounds to justify Iran's attack, the remarks that you just made are very key in remembering how Iran has been operating over the span of 40 years, that it cannot, one action or one possibly error by the United States or any other international body cannot explain the shooting down of the flight, because we know that over the span of the last 40 years, how Iran has violated or has conducted numerous acts that it has blamed the international community, the sanctions or other pressures on it, use these to justify its own wrongdoings. So thank you for those essential remarks. I will turn the floor over to Honourable Mr. Goodell.
There, did that work? Good, thank you. Roya, thank you very much. And distinguished guests on this important panel. Good morning from Saskatchewan, good afternoon to where most of you are located. I too acknowledge, as Senator McPhedran did earlier, that I'm speaking today from the territory of Treaty Number 4. Let me begin by once again expressing the profound condolences, not only of myself, but obviously the Government of Canada, to the families of the victims who have suffered so very much. And you heard that expressed in a very tangible and moving way by Hamid a few moments ago. All Canadians shared that sense of loss and grievance and outrage. And even though it is now a week beyond 6 months when this horrible event occurred, the feelings among the families are as raw and emotional as they were at the beginning, understandably so. But I believe the steadfast commitment of Canadians remains as strong as it was at the outset. And even though there has been considerable passage of time, and there will be more, we cannot allow our resolve in any way to weaken with the days that go by. I want to thank all the participants. Senator McPhedran, good to see you again, and Michael. It's always a pleasure to be associated with colleagues and former colleagues, and to the members of the panel, Mr. Esmaeillion, Professor Akhavan, and my friend and colleague Irwin Cotler. It's good to hear all of you as you talk in such a a learned way about this horrible situation. My purpose in joining the discussion today is to listen. My function is to offer advice and counsel to the Prime Minister and the Government of Canada. My mandate is really threefold, and in what you have said in this conversation for the last hour, you have touched on all parts of the mandate. Number one, assist Ministers Champagne and Garneau in their pursuit of accountability and transparency and ultimately justice for the families. Partly that is dealing with the immediate needs, such as the consular issues that had to be dealt with, the travel arrangements that had to be organized, the initial compensation funding that was not compensation, but funding for the families to assist with their costs, and a variety of other administrative arrangements, repatriation of the remains of the victims, helping in many different ways to try to alleviate the angst and the anguish of this awful time. So part of the mandate is to support the ministers in the ongoing effort that we'll need to continue. The second part of my mandate is to develop for Canada an inventory of the very best governmental practices to be available if and when another tragedy of this nature should present itself. We all hope it never will, but we all realize that we may have to face this sometime in the future. Well, we need to have the accumulated experience from this horrible event, together with others in our past and recent past, to make sure that we have, if you will, an instruction manual for the Government of Canada for how to deal with all of the issues that come from these awful circumstances, but most particularly, how do you best address the pressing needs of the families of the victims? The third requirement of my mandate is to offer advice in support of Canada's Safer Skies initiative to identify ways in which the international community can prevent this from ever happening again. And that was the last portion of Hamid's very passionate presentation. How do we make sure that to the extent we can, that the rules are changed, the procedures are changed in international law and international behavior to prevent the circumstances that led to this awful disaster from happening again. Just excuse me a moment. I listened once again today to the passion with which Mr. Esmaeillion addressed us all. It was heart-wrenching. The grief and the anger are very real and entirely normal, natural. That's how a human being reacts. And as painful as this is, that passion from him and from the other members of the families that I've had the opportunity to meet, at least in a virtual way, because of the limitations that have been imposed upon us in terms of travel and communication. We've had the opportunity to communicate over the phone and through video conferences like this. But constantly hearing the repetition of his and the other family's grief, that's the fuel that will continue to drive the pursuit of justice and real answers and the truth. And Ahmed, I welcome your unrelenting determination to make sure that this process gets to where it needs to be. And let me say in a practical way, I really do value the contribution that Ahmed and other family members have made, the ongoing contribution to the collection of essential information and evidence. There's been a great volume of material submitted by the families who are monitoring every bit of activity that is going on, and doing so in several different languages, and making that information, the interviews, the commentaries, the social media material, and so forth, making all of that available to the appropriate investigative agencies in the Government of Canada. And all of that is being meticulously assembled for the kind of forensic analysis that needs to be done. And that work is underway. It is painstaking. It is voluminous. In some ways, it's expensive, but we have made the very clear commitment that we will do everything in our power. We will leave no stone unturned where we've got the ability to turn it in order to get to the truth. And we certainly hear the point that Ahmed and Professor Akhavan and others have made, that that compensation and the other reparations that are contemplated in international law are important, and we will go through the process that we're required to follow in order to deal with those issues. But money is not the issue here. The issue is the truth. And there are two sets of questions for which we need very clear answers. There are hundreds of questions, but two sets of questions that are particularly important. One set is, what exactly is the sequence of events? And what exactly was the sequence of decision-making that led to two missiles being fired at a civilian aircraft, killing 176 people, including 55 Canadians and 30 permanent residents? Meticulously, we need to reassemble that flow of events to understand exactly what happened and why and how it happened. And then secondly, the fundamental question: why was that aircraft in the air at that particular point in time? And why was that airspace over a conflict zone open? And how was that decision taken that led to PS752 flying into mortal jeopardy? I very much appreciate the advice and the counsel of an old friend like Irwin Cotler and a new friend like Payam Akhavan, both of whom I've had the opportunity to consult as we've done our work so far, and I look forward to continuing that consultation. Professor Akhavan made the point about a long-term commitment. This is going to take great patience and unquenchable perseverance. We have both. We will work for the answers as quickly as we can get them, but it is going to take a lot of patience and perseverance in order to get to the truth. And we will do what we need to do to solve as much as we can that thirst for facts and information and knowledge and wisdom and the truth. We don't underestimate the magnitude of the challenge or the impediments that will be put in our way, but we will work assiduously on our own. We will work in close partnership with Ukraine, that has a very important role to play here as the domicile of the aircraft. And in the international frame of things, that's important. And the other countries, Sweden, the UK, Afghanistan, in order to bring all the leverage of international influence to bear in helping us to get the answers that the families deserve. It's a painful, gut-wrenching experience. I think this is the toughest assignment I've ever had as someone engaged on behalf of the government of Canada. But I will do my very best, and I know that applies to Minister Champagne, Minister Garneau, and certainly to the Prime Minister, to bring a satisfactory conclusion to a bitterly painful experience. And for all of your counsel and advice and suggestions and recommendations, I thank you for that this morning. And you may rest assured that all of the input that you have to offer will be valued highly by the Government of Canada as we work to get to the answers that are required. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the moving words, Honourable Mr. Goodell. We have come to the end of our panel, and I want to say that just as Hamid has become the voice of so many people who have lost a loved one in the past 40 years in Iran, or have their children or their loved ones in prison, this case too has become a focal point for Iranians everywhere. And all eyes are on this task, on the job of this committee to achieve a justice that not only the victims of this case are long overdue, but the nation has been long trying to achieve over the past 40 years. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Its reverberations and its consequences will surely go beyond just this particular flight. And we all wish you great luck, and thank you especially to Canada for taking the lead on advocating for the issue of human rights in Iran, and more than any other nation in the past many years. And thank you especially to the Raoul Wallenberg Center for having become a voice for those people who have otherwise, as immigrants, as refugees, have no other place to turn to. So thank you all, and we all, I'm sure, will never forget the words that we particularly heard from Hamid, and may he and others lead our way through a day that will see justice be done to this case.